On the night of December 31st, 2024, the Anderson family, John, Sarah, Mark, Lily, and little Ben, seemed like any other suburban family, blissfully preparing to ring in the new year. But by January 1st, they would be found dead in their own home, victims of a chilling and brutal crime. The only suspect? Jessica, Sarah's estranged sister. A family torn apart, a betrayal beyond comprehension, and a mystery that would rock a community to its core. What could possibly drive someone so close to the Andersons to commit such a horrific act? The Anderson family had always been the epitome of suburban perfection. Living in a picturesque home in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, they seemed to have everything one could desire: peaceful surroundings, a well-kept lawn, and a sense of belonging in the community. John, a successful lawyer, and his wife Sarah, a devoted stay-at-home mother, had built a life that many envied. Their 3 children, Mark, Lily, and little Ben, were their pride and joy. Mark, at 18, was already a freshman in college, studying engineering, while Lily was in high school, a bright and enthusiastic teenager with dreams of becoming a writer. Ben, only 7 years old, was full of life and energy, his laughter often echoing through the halls of their home. On the night of December 31st, 2024, the Andersons were preparing to ring in the new year in their usual, low-key way. It was a tradition they had cherished over the years: a simple family dinner, followed by some champagne and perhaps a movie or two before the clock struck midnight. John had planned to cook one of his famous steaks on the grill, and Sarah had spent the afternoon baking cookies. The children were excited for the evening, especially Ben, who had a fondness for the fireworks they sometimes watched on TV. The house was warm and cozy, filled with the smells of roasted vegetables and freshly baked treats. The evening passed peacefully, with no hints of the horror that would soon unfold. They shared stories, joked about the upcoming year, and savored the comfort of one another's company. It felt like any other New Year's Eve. There were no tensions in the air, no hidden secrets, just a happy family spending their last evening together before the year turned. The night sky outside was clear, with a blanket of stars that seemed to glow brighter than usual. But as the evening wore on, there was an undercurrent of unease that seemed to creep into the corners of the house. It wasn't something that could be explained easily, but Sarah, in particular, felt it. Perhaps it was the quietness of the neighborhood, with no other families hosting parties or gatherings that night. Or maybe it was the strange silence that had settled over the house. At times she thought she heard a faint tapping against the windows, but when she went to check, there was nothing there. Her instincts told her that something was off, but she brushed it aside as just the normal anxieties that could come with such a festive night. Around 11:30 p.m., after the family had shared their champagne and played a few rounds of board games, Sarah suggested they all get ready for bed. The children, of course, protested at first, but the promise of a new year quickly swept away their resistance. Mark went to his room to catch up on some reading. Lily disappeared into her phone, and Ben was tucked into bed, ready for the excitement of the next morning. John and Sarah shared a quiet moment together, talking about their hopes for the future. As midnight approached, the sounds of the outside world grew quieter. The neighborhood, typically filled with distant chatter and laughter during New Year's celebrations, had fallen into an unsettling silence. Neighbors later described hearing strange noises from the Anderson house, as if something was happening inside. The lights in their living room flickered briefly, and there was a shadow of movement near the front porch, but no one paid it much attention. In the back of their minds, everyone in the neighborhood would later wonder, could the killer have already been lurking, unnoticed by the family who had no idea what fate awaited them? The peaceful facade of the Anderson family's last night on Earth would soon shatter, and their perfect world would be torn apart forever. The morning of January 1st, 2025, began like any other. The sun rose gently over the suburban neighborhood, casting a soft light over the neatly kept homes. But as the clock ticked past 9 a.m., A sense of dread began to fill the air. The Anderson family, usually the first to greet the new year with cheerful greetings and laughter, had failed to respond to calls, texts, or even knocks on the door. Concerned, a neighbor, Mrs. Fitzgerald, who had known the family for years, decided to take matters into her own hands. She had grown used to seeing Sarah and John out in the yard each morning, tending to their garden or chatting over coffee. But this morning there was nothing. No movement from the house, no familiar voices. Mrs. Fitzgerald, her concern growing with each passing minute, called the police. They arrived at the Anderson home just before 10 a.m., met with an eerily quiet scene. The house stood as it always did, pristine and perfect on the outside, but there was an unsettling feeling in the air. The officers rang the doorbell, but there was no answer. After a few moments, one of them gently tried the door, finding it unlocked. It was unusual for the Andersons to leave the door open, especially on such a quiet morning. The officers stepped inside cautiously, calling out to the family. The silence that followed was deafening. They moved slowly through the house, calling out again, each room they entered growing colder with the realization that something was horribly wrong. The house was eerily still. The lights were dim, and the only sound was the quiet shuffle of their footsteps on the hardwood floor. Everything appeared as it should, no signs of forced entry, no visible signs of a break-in. Yet the sense of unease grew as they continued to search. When they reached the first bedroom, the scene inside was enough to make any officer's blood run cold. John and Sarah Anderson were both lying motionless in their bed, their bodies positioned unnaturally, as if they had been caught off guard. The bed was not disturbed, and there were no signs of a struggle. It seemed almost as though they had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. But that was impossible. Their bodies told a different story. There was blood. A disturbing amount of blood. And yet, curiously, there were no obvious injuries. The blood was pooled under them in odd, unnatural patterns, but nothing seemed to make sense. The officers proceeded to the children's rooms, their hearts pounding with each step. When they opened Mark's door, they found him in his bed, the sheets stained with blood, his face expressionless. His room was neat, like everything else in the house, with no signs of a struggle. The same was true for Lily and Ben. Lily lay in her bed, curled up under the covers, her face frozen in an unsettling stillness. Ben, the youngest, was tucked in tightly, his small body cold and lifeless. At first glance, it was almost as though the family had all passed away peacefully in their sleep. But the officers knew that couldn't be true. There was something horribly wrong here. They called for additional support, and soon the police were joined by detectives, forensic teams, and specialists. They began to comb through every inch of the house, looking for any clues, any sign that would explain this tragic, baffling event. But as the hours passed and the investigation grew deeper, nothing made sense. There were no signs of forced entry into the home, no signs of a robbery. No one had heard or seen anything unusual. The doors and windows had all been locked securely. The security system had been disarmed, but there were no signs of a hack or forced deactivation. It was as if the family had been murdered by someone who knew them intimately, someone who could come and go without raising suspicion. But who could do such a thing? Who could have killed the Andersons in cold blood and left no trace behind? The questions piled up, but the answers remained elusive. In the days that followed, the small town was filled with shock, disbelief, and fear. Everyone knew the Andersons, and no one could understand why anyone would want to harm them. The community was shaken to its core. But as the police dug deeper into the case, one question kept resurfacing: what had happened to the Andersons, and why had they been so brutally murdered in their own home? The answers seemed almost impossible to find. As the days passed, the shock of the Anderson family's deaths began to settle over the small community like a dark cloud. The local news stations were flooded with reports, and everyone in the town of Maple Ridge felt the weight of the tragedy. The Andersons had been so well known, so beloved, that their sudden and brutal death seemed incomprehensible. Friends, neighbors, and even distant relatives gathered at their homes to mourn, but there was little they could do to make sense of what had happened. Everyone kept asking the same question: who would want to kill such a perfect family? In the wake of the tragedy, the police worked tirelessly to investigate every lead. They had little to go on. No one in the neighborhood had seen or heard anything suspicious in the days leading up to the murders. The Andersons had no known enemies, no outstanding debts, and no history of conflict. The detectives began interviewing everyone who had been close to the family members, friends, co-workers, and even acquaintances from the community, but each person painted a picture of a happy, well-adjusted family with no apparent reason for someone to harm them. A few days after the discovery, the police received a tip from a neighbor who had seen something strange on the night of the murders. Mrs. Walters, a woman who lived 2 doors down from the Andersons, had been out walking her dog just before midnight on New Year's Eve. She had noticed a car parked in front of the Andersons' home. It was an older sedan, dark in color, and she thought it looked out of place in the otherwise quiet neighborhood. Mrs. Walters didn't think much of it at the time, just a car, maybe someone visiting, but the sight of it stuck with her. It wasn't until the next day, when she saw the police at the house, that the car registered in her mind. The police quickly traced the car to a local man named Frank Miller, who had no apparent connection to the Andersons. When they brought him in for questioning, Frank was cooperative, but his answers were evasive. He claimed he was just driving around the neighborhood that night, thinking about his recent breakup, and stopped briefly to pull over and clear his head. He hadn't seen anyone at the Anderson house, and he certainly hadn't gone inside. Still, the detectives weren't convinced. Frank's story didn't add up. His car had been spotted in the area at the exact time of the murders, and the police had no reason to believe he was just a random passerby. As the investigation deepened, the forensic team scoured the Anderson home for any trace of the killer. They examined the crime scene with a meticulous eye, looking for clues that would reveal the identity of the perpetrator. The bloodstains, the positioning of the bodies, and the absence of any signs of forced entry all seemed to point to someone who knew the family well. There were no signs of struggle in the bedrooms, and the bodies were found exactly where they had last been seen. It was almost as if the Andersons had invited the killer inside, or had been caught off guard by someone they trusted. Meanwhile, the local community was left reeling. The Andersons had been pillars of the town, involved in countless charity events, church services, and local gatherings. Sarah had volunteered at the school. John had coached Little League, and the children were well known for their kindness and intelligence. No one in town could imagine who would want to harm them. Even as the investigation progressed, the police had no clear suspect. It wasn't just the town that was shaken. The police officers, too, were struggling to comprehend the brutality of the crime. The Andersons had been murdered in the most chilling way, without warning, without motive. And yet, as the police delved further into the case, they began to notice a pattern emerging. Something didn't sit right with them, something that felt more personal than a random act of violence. The more they examined the family's lives, the more they realized the murder was not an isolated event. There was something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface that no one had seen coming. But what could it be? And who was responsible for such a heinous act? The answers felt agonizingly out of reach. After days of fruitless investigation, a breakthrough finally came when the Anderson family's security footage was reviewed. Initially, the police had neglected to check it, assuming it was just another ordinary security system that hadn't been tampered with. However, as the case grew colder, the detectives decided to revisit the possibility of hidden clues. They pulled the video files from the Andersons' home security cameras, eager for anything that could shed light on the mystery. The footage was from several cameras placed around the house, including the front and back yards, as well as the main entrance. As the detectives combed through the hours of footage, they began to notice something strange. At approximately 11:20 p.m. on New Year's Eve, just before midnight, a figure appeared on the back porch. This was unusual because the back door, typically locked at night, was wide open. The figure moved with purpose, entering the house through the unlocked door without hesitation. The person was dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured by a hoodie, making it impossible to identify them right away. The security footage was grainy, and the camera's angle wasn't perfect, but the movement of the figure was unmistakable. They seemed to know exactly where they were going, heading straight into the house without any signs of searching for the entry point or hesitation. The killer walked through the kitchen, out of view of the cameras, and toward the bedrooms where the Anderson family was sleeping. There was no noise, no indication that the intruder had encountered any resistance. The footage was chillingly calm, as if the figure was entering a place they belonged, not an intruder in the traditional sense. For the next several minutes, the cameras captured no further movement, and the footage seemed to stop at random. The next relevant footage came around 12:05 a.m., when the figure was seen leaving through the back door again. The person walked out of the house as quietly as they had entered, disappearing into the night. By all appearances, the killer had not disturbed anything else in the house. There were no broken windows, no overturned furniture, nothing had been stolen. The only things that had been disturbed were the lives of the Anderson family. This new discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. Whoever this figure was, they had been allowed into the home. The back door was typically locked each night, and it was only opened if someone had known the family or had been expected. The killer was not a stranger to the Andersons. This was someone familiar, someone who had access to the house without raising suspicion. It raised a chilling possibility: could the killer be someone close to the family? The police refocused their efforts on those who had close relationships with the Andersons, thinking perhaps they had missed something in their earlier interviews. The lead detective, feeling the weight of the case, went back through their notes, re-examining every connection the Andersons had. He re-interviewed their friends, family members, co-workers, and even neighbors. The fact that the killer knew the layout of the house so well made it clear they had to have been in the home before. But who? That's when one name began to emerge from the depths of the investigation: Jessica. She was Sarah Anderson's estranged sister, someone no one had considered in the early days of the investigation. Jessica had lived in a different city for several years, but recently she and Sarah had begun to reconnect. It was not a smooth reconciliation, as Sarah had expressed concerns about Jessica's mental health. There were reports of erratic behavior. Jessica had been financially struggling, involved in some volatile relationships, and even had a history of substance abuse. As Sarah tried to distance herself from the turmoil Jessica brought, tensions between the two had been escalating. The more the police dug, the more it became clear that Jessica had been involved in a dispute with her sister in the weeks leading up to the murders. Sarah had confided in a few close friends that she was worried about Jessica's recent behavior. But could Jessica be capable of something as horrific as this? The detectives now knew they had to follow this lead. It was an eerie twist in the case. For days they had been focused on outside threats, on strangers, but now the possibility that the killer was someone within the family, someone who had been trusted and welcomed into their home, was far too real to ignore. It was the kind of betrayal that made the case all the more sinister. As the investigation continued, The detectives braced themselves for the possibility that the final chapter of the Anderson family's story would be far darker than anyone could have imagined. The investigation into Jessica Anderson, Sarah's estranged sister, took a disturbing turn when the police uncovered an unsettling history of violence and instability. Jessica had been living on the edge for years, grappling with a range of personal issues, from financial ruin to relationships marred by anger and addiction. Her attempts at reconciliation with Sarah had been strained and fraught with tension. According to Sarah's friends, while Sarah had tried to be there for Jessica, she had grown increasingly worried about her sister's emotional state. The more Sarah had tried to distance herself from the drama, the more Jessica seemed to resent it. The police soon discovered that Jessica had been in Maple Ridge on New Year's Eve. She had contacted Sarah in the days before, claiming to be in town for a brief visit, and Sarah had reluctantly agreed to meet with her. According to records, Sarah had invited Jessica over for dinner earlier that week. The meeting, however, had not gone as planned. Reports from Sarah's close friends revealed that the two sisters had gotten into a heated argument that night, with Sarah telling Jessica that she needed space and could not continue to enable her erratic behavior. Jessica had left angrily, and there were signs that the disagreement had escalated to something more. Sarah had confided to one friend that she was afraid her sister was capable of doing something she would regret. It was a chilling comment, and no one realized how prophetic it would turn out to be. By the time the police were closing in on Jessica, she had already left town again, moving to another city. She had remained out of contact with the family, and even denied knowing anything about the tragedy when detectives reached out to her. But when they checked her phone records, they found something unsettling. Jessica's phone had pinged a tower near the Anderson home around the time of the murders. The timing was too close to be a coincidence. Jessica had been in Maple Ridge, in the vicinity of the Andersons' home, just before and after the killings. The police had their prime suspect. When they finally located Jessica and brought her in for questioning, she was unnervingly calm. Her demeanor was almost eerily detached, as if she were unable or unwilling to comprehend the gravity of the situation. She denied any involvement in the deaths of her sister and the rest of the family, claiming that she had been out of town during the time of the murders, and that she had nothing to do with what had happened. But as the police presented her with the evidence, the phone records, the security footage, and the fact that she had been near the house, they began to see cracks in her story. In a moment of apparent frustration, Jessica snapped. She admitted to being at the Anderson house on New Year's Eve, though she claimed she had left hours before the murders took place. But her answers grew increasingly erratic. She denied committing the murders, but her reluctance to explain her presence near the scene of the crime only fueled suspicions. The detectives confronted her with the fact that they had found traces of her fingerprints on the back door of the house, traces that had not been there when the family had left for the evening, but appeared later, suggesting someone had tampered with the entrance. Still, Jessica insisted that she had no part in what happened. But the evidence was damning. As the pressure mounted, Jessica finally broke. She confessed to being the one who had killed the Andersons, but the reasoning behind it was incomprehensible. She spoke of jealousy and resentment, of feeling abandoned and unloved by her family. Her mind, already frayed by years of personal turmoil, had snapped in a moment of rage. What had started as an argument with Sarah had spiraled out of control, leading Jessica to do something she could never take back. She explained that in a fit of fury, she had waited until the family was asleep before entering the house. She couldn't remember exactly how it all unfolded, but she knew she had killed them. And in the aftermath, she had left the house as quietly as she had entered, with no intention of being caught.